Boom! Let's talk about problematic feminism in Greek mythology retellings. Ever since the magnificent Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller came out, we've been in a wave of Greek mythology retellings. As a fellow who has a degree in Greek and Latin culture and language, this has been some peak time for me. However, it also makes me internally cringe. Before we get into the nitty-gritties, I want to preface by saying that I am more than aware, definitely more than aware than most, about the deep misogyny in ancient Greek culture. I'm not coming here to say it wasn't patriarchal and sucky. What I'm saying is that some feminist Greek mythology retellings are weak-ass sauce, and here's why. This rant is brought to you by the release of Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. This is not meant to be like a specific call out to her, although a little bit. But since she's the woman of the Greek mythology retelling hour, it's on you. Before we get into the issues specific to Ariadne in particular, let's take a closer look at Greek mythology and history. What people fail to understand a lot of the times is that when they talk about Greek culture and mythology as patriarchal, they're referring to a period of time that spans thousands of years. Ancient Greece and the development of their mythology took place over, let me repeat, thousands of years. Would you, as a member of the year 2021, think you shared completely your ideologies with someone not only from the 1700s, but from the early, CEs? If you and a pilgrim and a Gallic warrior walked into a bar, someone might consider y'all from the same time period. That's what we're saying to a bunch of dead Greek people. Once again, every time period was still pretty sexist compared to today. However, considering time periods that came after ancient Greece, they weren't the least progressive, okay? And that's not taking into account the difference of people groups within the ancient Greek culture, all of whom had different varied ideas throughout their personal histories. This is all to say that when people say that ancient Greek was sexist, I ask, to which part are you referring? Remember, in ancient Greece, there were also feminist mythology retellers. Let's take Medusa as an example of feminist retellings, since Saint Ariadne brings her up. Medusa's story was morphed over time into something as unrecognizable as Medusa herself. Her first written appearance seemed to come from Hesiod, in whose story she's one of three sisters who Poseidon made love to in a field and who is killed by Perseus. She's not mentioned as having snake hair. She's not mentioned to turn people to stone. For all intents and purposes, Perseus rolled into her house, chopped up a random lady's head, and carried it around like a weirdo. Through the thousands of years in which Greek mythology developed, they realized that this was lame as hell and kind of creepy from Perseus's perspective. And so Medusa got snake hair and cool powers and also a rape story in which Athena victim blames. It's actually Ovid who starts with the snake hair shit. And while Ovid's cool, he's also Roman, and there is a difference. So he had his own political agenda going on that had nothing to do with the original ancient Greek story. Different people have tried to take Medusa back for the feminists in history. Helen Suzhou comes to mind right away with the laugh of Medusa, and she makes a valid argument in the fact that Medusa, while being raped in Athena's temple, begs the goddess for help, and in response Athena turns her into an ugly stone maker, which for all intents and purposes gives Medusa the power to fight her attackers in the future and prevent anyone from touching her ever again. The point is, history changes, and Greek myths change too, and there have been many of ancient Greek scholars who have also made the claim that Medusa can be feministly retold. To claim that one myth needs to be seen through a feminist lens, or that finally, in 2021, a mythological woman in 2021, a mythological woman is finally getting the voice she never had takes away from the work of many people, most especially the ancient Greeks, who themselves rewrote the works as feminist texts. Would it be easier if only classical scholars rewrote Greek mythology? From my perspective, yes. Would they be as exciting? Probably not. However, a research attempt should still be made, especially when the characters in your novel are fucking famous and have been so for thousands of years. With all that out of the way, let's get into Ariadne. I'll get into the general things I didn't enjoy about the book before I beef on the mythology. The first critique I have for this book is that it really loved to tell and didn't show for shit. Like, the first 75 pages are literally just Ariadne telling us the story of her past, and then Theseus telling us the story of his past through Ariadne's narrative. Very little setting is expressed. Frankly, Ariadne comes off as a little bit of a dumbass, and at least a very naive person. In her original myth, she wasn't like the most world-weary individual, but she also was like the brains of the Minotaur operation, so that just kind of didn't track. And frankly, I see this a lot in mythology retellings recently, where authors decide to choose a woman who is middle ground enough that she has like a little bit of plot, rather than someone like Andromeda, who kind of does nothing at all while Perseus saves the day, but not enough personality to be problematic, like Medea. This is a form of cowardice, and I don't abide. It's also just bad feminism. It's the sort of feminism which is digestible to the masses, and that sort of feminism has historically also been whitewashed and heteronormatized. It's the search for strong female characters that can do shit, but who is also in a love triangle for some inexplicable reason. I think of Madeline Miller's Circe as well here, which tries to make a witch living on an island for thousands of years alone interesting and inevitably fails. And on top of that, Miller tries to make Circe likable, and thus takes away the really interesting shit that Circe does, like turning men into pigs. Sure, these women's childhoods sucked, and it is an interesting character to study. However, at the same time, get to the fucking plot, my dudes. You're writing a novel, not a character study. Making a boss bitch into a relatable and yet somehow more mild-mannered woman than the original myth, which you claim is anti-feminist, is both boring to read and whitewashed as fuck. So, we've got Ariadne, who falls in love with Theseus on sight because he's the first dude she's ever seen who she's not related to. This tracks, so whatever. Ariadne had already made a mention that her mother, Pasiphae, who was really the one who had to suffer for Minos' crimes, and then in the same fucking paragraph, she essentially called her mom weak-willed for having trauma over a fucking rape story. So, feminist. Ariadne makes the claim that she would prefer to be like Medusa than her mother, as Medusa slayed the day while her mom kind of goes crazy. I can't even get in to how fucked up that is. So I'm gonna let y'all think on that one. You'll see. The story pretty much continues on that not feminist train for like the entire rest of the story, even with the incorporation of Phaedra's narrative, which as a sidebar was fine, but also why the fuck did you name the novel after one woman if she wasn't even exciting enough to carry the full plot via her narrative? We get this dichotomy between willful woman Phaedra, who is often pitted against Ariadne, the good woman. On the opposite end, we get Ariadne being boofed on for not doing shit. So we have these two sisters, both treated like shit by Minos and Theseus, who rarely support each other truly in the book because they're jealous of one another. I'm not saying that kind of thing isn't realistic. However, don't fucking call this a feminist retelling with a plot like that on the table. Mythology doesn't tell us how Phaedra and Ariadne felt about each other. Satan had free reign over this one. And what she decided to do with it was the same old song and dance of women not supporting women. And for what? Jealousy over dudes. Phaedra's mythological ending is pretty set in stone. There are some differences in narrative, but for the most part, it ends up with Phaedra and Hippolytus dead. Ariadne's ending, however, is a little different. In the most common narrative Ariadne has, she becomes a goddess. In the novel, Dionysus talks about how he brought his mother back from the dead. In most myths, he does the same, and sometimes he does it like at the same time for Ariadne. The narrative for Ariadne dying at Perseus's hands is another very less common ending to her story. However, even in that ending, she's raised from the dead and becomes a goddess. In none of these fucking endings did Ariadne become a fucking, like, sentient constellation. This ending confused me deeply, mainly because I had no fucking clue why Saint decided that in her essentially mythologically true narrative, she was going to bust out a curveball at the end. Also, the fact that Ariadne's rise to godhood in the original myth is lit as hell. Becoming a god is literally the most powerful thing that can happen to a person, and Ariadne's reaching that status gives her power in her own right, and that kicks ass. Like, she kicks ass in other myths when she's a goddess. But instead, Saint decides to keep her mortal, which, like, I can get humans are great and all that, and she did have some beef with Dionysus at the end, so, like, okay. However, turning her into a constellation essentially makes her a freaking tapestry for Dionysus to stare at for the rest of all eternity. Literally, her end is to watch for all eternity things she has no power to change, which I was kind of hoping she'd overcome at some point in the book. So essentially, you took the original Greek ending, which gives Ariadne god powers and autonomy, and changed it up in your feminist retelling, so that she is powerless and literally only there to be stared at by the male gaze. The point of all this is to freaking say that if you're going to make a feminist retelling of anything, make sure that at the very least, it is more feminist than the original.